Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. We have covered many of the greatest warriors and combatants from many of the biggest and most significant fighting game franchises on this channel over the years. Today is going to be no different as we continue the theme of looking at the most interesting and integral characters in all of Street Fighter lore. With so many Street Fighter games in existence, it probably isn't surprising that the story that ties them all together is a convoluted one, and few characters who exist within its universe have a history more confusing than that of Charlie Nash. In fact, at one point it seems that Capcom decided to try and completely rewrite this character's origin. So, in today's upload, we are going to not only try to understand why, but also look at how he ended up going from a mere reference in a backstory to a fully fleshed out member of the Street Fighter roster and one of the most pivotal parts of its canon. That's right folks, today we're going to be polishing off our dog tags and closely examining the history of the United States Air Force standout, Charlie Nash, a character who has died 4 times at least. Yeah! Although he didn't make his debut as a playable character until several years later, the first time we hear any reference of Charlie at all is in the original Street Fighter II The World Warrior, all the way back in 1991 when the franchise went mainstream. Here we learn that he is in fact a first lieutenant in the United States Air Force. He is first brought to our attention by the king of high strength hair gel himself, Guile, who references the fact that the reason he has entered the tournament in the first place is to confront and get revenge on M. Bison for what he did to his pal Charlie in Cambodia many years ago. I should add that any mention of Cambodia in the original story was added to Guile's ending in the Western release, as the Japanese version of the game makes no reference to this whatsoever. Confusingly, to make the situation more perplexing, Charlie Nash was initially known simply as Nash in the Japanese version of The World Warrior, and Charlie in all overseas variants. We all know how keen Capcom are to change the names of characters in localizations, but this time it was supposedly done because they felt Western audiences wouldn't see Nash as a very natural sounding name, so decided to give him a more friendly and traditional sounding moniker. At least it's not as bad as the mess we were left with after swapping all of the names of the OG Street Fighter II bosses around though, eh? It wasn't actually until the release of the Udon Street Fighter comic book adaptation in 2003 that the two names Charlie and Nash were combined, giving our war hero a real full name for the first time, and some much needed regional consistency. Something the Street Fighter franchise is all too often lacking in. To add yet further confusion to the roots of the name, there is also a fairly famous and successful championship level Irish boxer from the 70s and 80s called Charlie Nash, who represented Ireland at the Olympics at amateur level and challenged for legitimate world titles as a pro during his career. Now bear in mind this is all just purely speculation and there's nothing official on this to say that Capcom named their fighter after the former Olympian, but it does seem remarkably coincidental given the Street Fighter character's purported Irish-American background and boxing combo heavy pugilistic style. We first get to both see and play as Charlie in video game form in the 1995 seminal arcade classic Street Fighter Alpha Warrior's Dreams, or Street Fighter Zero if you're from Japan. As the Alpha series serves as a direct prequel to the events of The World Warrior, we get to become acquainted with Charlie before he meets his untimely end at the hands of that psycho power wielding git M. Bison. This version of Charlie wears some rather fetching clothes consisting of baggy green cargo pants stolen straight from the wardrobe of MC Hammer, matching green combat boots with a light orange flak vest that resembles one of those awful puffer jackets that were fashionable with inner city youths and Ali G during the late 90s and early 2000s. Ugh. He also wears green wristbands to go with his pants and boots, and sports a rather exaggerated blonde hairstyle with a huge quiff that comes out at an angle and covers his face. One can only assume that he and good buddy Guile were trying to outdo each other with their preposterous hair decisions. At least they could save a little bit of money by sharing a supply of high strength hair gel though, right? Charlie starts each bout with a pair of cool guy sunglasses, but wisely takes them off and puts them in his jacket before combat commences. only to put them straight back on again after he wins. A lot of his manoeuvres and specials, as well as his general fighting style, are very reminiscent of Guile's, which makes perfect narrative sense given that they train together. Although there is some variation of moves between the pair and several performance differences, Charlie performs both of Guile's trademark moves, the Flash Kick and Sonic Boom specials, and acts as something of a mirrored character, much like with the more established pairing of Ryu and Ken. As we've already been made well aware of Charlie's fate in Guile's Street Fighter 2 ending, it's not much of a spoiler to discover that our man meets his untimely end at the hands of the evil M. Bison during his alpha completion screen. After making it all the way through the tournament and finally defeating Bison in the final, he foolishly believes he has the evil bugger captured, and calls ahead to his base to get someone down to apprehend the hat-obsessed lunatic. While radioing his base to inform them that he has control of the nefarious drug lord, we see Bison sneak up behind the distracted Charlie and do away with him with his psycho powers. Bison responds back to Charlie's base with a chilling line, "His army is my army. Bison rules all. Did he truly believe I would let him live?" It seems this new version of Charlie's death retcons what Guile references in his Street Fighter 2 ending, as the two stories don't seem to match up. It's extremely likely that Capcom had no intention of ever making Charlie, or Nash, a future playable character when Guile's story arc was originally written, and simply ended up shuffling a few things round to make the character make more sense. Despite his rather fatal troubles at the end of Warrior's Dreams, in classic Street Fighter fashion, Charlie was straight back for an appearance in the sequel, 1996's Alpha or 02, a video game that bloody retcons all of the endings that occurred in the first Alpha iteration. Sporting a pretty much identical look and moveset to the first Alpha game, bar a few tweaks here and there, Charlie's unfortunate but incredibly predictable run of bad luck was about to continue in his ending, as he once again confronts his nemesis and defeats Bison. This time he is gunned down once again from behind no less, by the corrupt officer paid off by Bison, who was flying the very helicopter that was supposed to be rescuing him. He is then thrown off the top of a huge cliff to his supposed death, by that same treacherous betraying officer. In classic overconfident evil final boss fashion, Bison elects not to send a recon team down to confirm Charlie's death, as he believes no one could survive that fall. "Even if he is alive, he won't be back," said Bison confidently. But wouldn't you just bloody know it, he was back, and he was back almost immediately in the third, final and probably the very best entry in the Alpha series, Alpha 3, a game that released to arcades internationally in June of 1998. This game saw the exception to the rule established in the previous two titles, as Charlie not only survived his final fight with Bison, he actually managed to bomb the Shadaloo base to the ground while Bison was inside it. This wasn't enough to thwart the evil tyrant, however, as Bison immediately rose from the ashes using his psycho power. Our hero finally vanquished the hat-loving heel when he circled back around and gunned him down in his jet fighter, Top Gun style. This cause for celebration would prove to be short-lived, however, as the following year's PlayStation port and all other subsequent console ports added Guile as a playable character, whose ending featured Charlie snuffing it once again. He is essentially Street Fighter's version of Kenny from South Park at this stage. Guile's rather sad completion screen sees he, Charlie and Chun-Li invade the Shadaloo base to plant a powerful bomb in there. As they are priming the explosion, Bison makes his presence felt, attacking Charlie and Guile with murderous intent. Just as he is about to execute his devastating Psycho Crusher on Guile, our guy heroically sacrifices himself by grabbing onto Bison from behind to stop him from getting away, whilst allowing Guile and Chunners to escape the blast. Charlie was unfortunately killed in the huge explosion, but at least the Shadaloo base had been destroyed and Bison had finally been defeated. "The base was totally demolished, Bison's psycho power is gone," said Guile. It's worth noting that there is often a bit of confusion and speculation about just what is and isn't canon in the Alpha series, but the events of Charlie's story contained in the Alpha 2 narrative are now considered the canon versions of events, despite being for all intents and purposes very much dead after the Alpha games and Street Fighter 2. 2008 Street Fighter 4 saw several hints to Charlie's survival in its storyline. It also saw Guile holding a pair of dog tags with the words Charlie Nash on them, which would mark the first in-game appearance of our hero's full name. The hinting and foreshadowing would eventually pay off in February 2016 when Street Fighter V was released worldwide on Unreal Engine 4 to the PlayStation 4 and Windows, featuring our pal Charlie as a selectable character in the original base roster. The indecisive Burks over at Capcom just couldn't resist faffing about with his name once again, this time calling him Nash officially in all regions, but referring to him as both Charlie and Charlie Nash at several points during the story. It's getting a bit confusing and silly now, but at least it appears as though they're finally settled on an internationally consistent name for the poor lad. Nash looks quite a bit different now, with several unsightly skin grafts over the visible parts of his body, which are indicative of what he has been through. He has large staples attaching a skin graft to his head and a green gem embedded in his forehead, similar to the ones used by Gil and Urien. The transplanted body parts and skin grafts are said to have come from Eleven, who was one of the Illuminati's failed mimicry experiments, which nicely ties him into the lore and narrative surrounding the Street Fighter III series of games. Speaking of the main villains of Street Fighter III, it appears that Urien, along with the Secret Society, are responsible for using their futuristic technology to bring Charlie back from the dead. As in his first story appearance, in the game he emerges from a stone coffin and is greeted by a woman named Helen. Helen is the woman who we see accompanying Gil to fights in the Street Fighter III games, and she tells Charlie she is relieved to see him alive. Upon awakening, Charlie has flashbacks of what M. Bison did to him and wants to seek revenge. Charlie asks Helen if she knows where he can find him. Helen admits that she does not know, but says she has other information that may be of use to him. She tells Charlie to give it some thought and gives him a few days to roam around the world to catch up with everything that has happened since his disappearance. Eventually he crosses paths with old friend Guile, who after observing his behaviour does not view him as behaving rationally, so decides not to interfere after his help is declined. Nash's attire is similar to the ones we're used to from his previous in-game appearances, with only slight colour and design alterations. His orange flak vest is now brown with a yellow collar and yellow pockets and sleeves, nicely matching his new brown cargo pants, while his combat boots and belt are now light green. He may not be amazingly good at staying alive, but Nash sure does know how to colour coordinate. He also now sports an expensive looking digital watch on his left wrist, which not only tells the time, but also plays a crude rudimentary LCD version of Tetris, which Nash enjoys playing either on the bus or between rounds in Street Fighter tournaments. As he is essentially held together by staples during his Street Fighter V appearance, Nash's lifespan is extremely limited this time around, and he must save his energy for his final fight with Bison. He tries to end the Shadaloo boss's reign of terror for good when he attempts the heroic sacrifice gimmick again, trying to absorb as much of Bison's power as possible in what was essentially a complete suicide mission, so he could weaken him enough in order for Ryu to be able to take him down. This was the last video game appearance to date of Nash, but despite being apparently deceased, Capcom have officially listed his status as unknown, giving reason to believe we could be seeing more of the little scamp in the future. It's not like he hasn't come back from beyond the grave before now, is it? Our man of many names, Charlie Nash, has also appeared in several side games and crossover fighters, such as X-Men vs Street Fighter, Marvel vs Capcom 2, and the never officially released Capcom Fighting All-Stars. He shows up alongside fellow Street Fighter alumni Cammy in the rather fun if slightly shallow arcade shooter Cannon Spike, released in Japan as Gunspike, and even appears as a spirit in the adventure mode of Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. There is a strange and mysterious alternate Charlie found as a bonus character in Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter called Shadow, which is basically a Charlie palette swap with all of his features and clothes darkened out to the point that you can't really make them out. Shadow also pops up as a support character in Marvel vs Capcom. Even with all of Charlie's appearances outside the main Street Fighter series of games, and his appearances in other media such as comic books and animations, perhaps his most noteworthy and eyebrow-raising showing is in the notorious 1994 So Bad It's Good live-action Street Fighter movie adaptation. Bear in mind this was released to cinemas almost a year before the first alpha game came out, but for some bizarre reason the writers of the movie felt compelled to cock up the story of not one, not 2, but 3 Street Fighter characters by inexplicably amalgamating Charlie and Blanka's backstories while also throwing Dao Sim into the mix for good measure. Now the good folks over at Capcom and Universal Pictures were telling us that Guile's good Brazilian pal and fellow soldier, Charlie Blanca, was captured by Raul Julia's version of Bison. When Bison discovers that Charlie and Guile are friends, he has Charlie tortured and mutated by his unwilling scientist Dr. Dao Sim. Dao Sim eventually turns him into the electric-powered, green-skinned, red-haired oaf we know and love today as Blanka. Why they had to mess about with so much of the established lore is absolutely beyond me, but it was quite common for movie adaptations of this era to take these kind of liberties, and it's still a fairly common practice today when it comes to video games being made into films. Things could have been worse, I suppose. They could have been as bad as the Super Mario Bros. Movie after all. So, despite Charlie's less than stellar record when it comes to keeping alive, and despite so much of his origin and backstory over various forms of media being littered with inconsistencies, Charlie, or Nash, or whatever you want to call him, has been one of the more enduring and popular characters in the whole Street Fighter franchise over the years. He's been pivotal to several key storyline moments and has been a constant thorn in the side of the series' main protagonist since the prequels. I think it's inevitable that we'll see him turn up again in one of the main entries. Perhaps it will be as soon as the upcoming Street Fighter 6, but only time will now tell us, I suppose. So ladies and gentlemen, that was the confusing and convoluted story of Charlie Nash, a character who has died over and over again. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the exciting universe of Street Fighter characters, I have made dozens and dozens of biopic style videos looking at the lives and times of various roster members. Why not check out my long boy of a video, for example, covering Street Fighter 2's 4 Grandmasters, or simply begin binge watching my Street Fighter character playlist. Like, subscribe, ring that notification bell and comment, you know, all the good stuff to help this channel grow. And if you really want to help me out, why not consider backing my channel over on Patreon. Speaking of my patrons, special thank yous go out to Ben Harradine, Carl Johnson, Hero Paula Lopez, Johnny Holly, Rowan Dinch, Evan Border, Azra Arkai, Ego, Jordan Durant, Ian Boyle, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, House of a Ted, Matt Fowle, Steve, Justin Wang, Hermes Gonzalez, Man Shovel, Sang Hee, Langston Miller, Flaming Renee, TOG Driver, Louis Viant, John Bates, David Ball, Antonio Rodriguez, Synth Spaces, Punk Toast, and everybody else who is kind enough to back my work over on the Patreon platform. In the words of Elvis Presley, thank you very much. Cheerio.